when it talks about in option 1 that it's to continue the way it's being managed now, it's to continue the way it's been managed since 2015.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
And then in options 2 and 3, it talks about the adaptive management, which was the 2000 adaptive management plan, right?
So alternative 2 is a lot of historical measures. Alternative 2 would essentially take us back to the way the program was run back when it was a success, back when we had over 100 animals on the landscape for a decade at a time. So yes, those are the measures that we know work and that we believe Fish and Wildlife Service should put back in place.
What we're calling alternative 3, which will focus federal management of the red wolf population in eastern North Carolina on those federal lands in Dare and Hyde County, Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, Dare County Bombing Range. Wolves would essentially be unregulated off of those federal lands. So currently, somebody that wants wolves removed from their property or wants to take wolves that are on their property needs authorization from the Fish and Wildlife Service to do it. This rule would remove that requirement that they seek authorization.
So right now, you can't hunt, trap, shoot, harm, kill, or even harass a red wolf unless you fall under one of the exceptions provided for in the regulations. So if that red wolf is threatening you, your property, your pets, your livestock, yes, you can take the actions you need to, but you can't just harass or harm the animal because it's out there on the landscape being an animal. The Fish and Wildlife Service's proposal would change that. It would allow anyone at any time for any reason not on a federal wildlife refuge to take a red wolf in any way they wanted. So again, hunting, trapping, shooting, poisoning, any of that would be fair game. And that is absolutely not the way to provide for the conservation and recovery of an endangered species.
And then the wolves that are on in the 204,000 acres.
Right.
When they wander off, they're not protected.
Right.
How's that going to work?
There will, I guess over time, throughout the 30-plus year history of the reintroduction effort, there's been 1, 2, sometimes 3 packs of wolves on the refuge and the bombing range at any one time. That's what we think it can sustain. Other wolves will disperse. That's what wolves do. Packs produce young animals, and those animals disperse out on the landscape. And what happens to those animals is really what is yet to be seen. Will they do as they've done over the past 30 years since the beginning of the program, move onto the private lands and establish packs and behave like wolves?
What we know from the history of this program is almost as soon as the red wolves were introduced to this area, they left the refuge.
Or will they not? Will the population truly be limited to the refuge and the bombing range? And that's going to depend entirely on the people of the Albemarle and others, that may be able to help find ways for wolves and people to coexist.
Refuge lands, by Fish and Wildlife Service's own admission, might support a maximum of 10 to 15 animals. So Fish and Wildlife Service itself is admitting that it only plans to protect 10 to 15 animals. And once those animals leave the refuge, they will not be protected. At the same time, Fish and Wildlife Service is proposing to put 5 new animals out on the landscape every year as part of this program.
And the other side of it that's very important is that the rule now will explicitly authorize us to do the things we know we need to do to manage a red wolf population. So our Red Wolf Adaptive Management Plan that includes the release of wolves from captivity into the wild, all the other things we do to manage red wolf and coyote interactions, the use of placeholders, all those are now incorporated into the rule. Whereas before, they were not.
Those animals would effectively be wandering off the landscape and getting shot as soon as they were reintroduced. It is just a pipeline of death for these animals.
I think there's a assumption that a lot of folks have made that any wolf that wanders off of the refuge or the bombing range is going to get shot. That's not necessarily true. So while it doesn't, while federal action's going to be focused on the refuge and the bombing range, it doesn't mean that the wolves cannot exist beyond that boundary. So the real question, and it is a question, is what will happen or what can happen. We have said in this proposal that we're focusing federal action on the federal property. And the rule removes the prohibitions on take of wolves off of private lands, but it doesn't preclude wolves from existing on private lands or state lands, outside of the federal estate.
So the Fish and Wildlife Service is required under federal law to provide for the conservation and recovery of listed species in the wild. That's their fundamental duty, is to provide for the conservation and recovery of species in the wild. And that goes for the red wolf.
So we can write whatever we need to have in the rule to manage that population and give it the best chance of success, with the objective being and the requirement being that our actions are furthering the conservation of the species. That's the legal standard, furthering the conservation of the species. The Endangered Species Act spells out things you have to do in a rulemaking. The Administrative Procedures Act spells out how the federal government goes about writing rules. And well, we have to have a public comment period. It's very important we get comments on the actual proposal. One thing we're trying to do, though, is move expeditiously, because the rules we've got, as I've said, aren't working for wolves or people.
To the extent they want to expeditiously proceed with a proposed rule that would scale back the program or even terminate the program, that's totally not what we need. What we need is expeditious action to save this species that's on the ground right now. This really is about the future and potentially the end of the only red wolf reintroduction, the only red wolf wild population in this country.
It's not a decision that's taken lightly. It's an important decision.